And a good afternoon to everyone watching from afar. You join us on a pretty miserable afternoon at St Mary's Perivale in West London. Delighted to have you joining a keen audience here to hear a lecture by the eminent pianist Peter Donohoe, who I've admired and respected from afar for the last 60 years or so. He's been, not quite 60, that's not true, 40 since his triumph in the Tchaikovsky competition, and he's been a major figure in the piano world, as everyone knows. I don't need to elaborate on that. He'll be talking about that, but it's a real privilege, and I mean that, to have him come to talk to us today about his life and the ups and downs of that glittering life in the mainstream of the top grade of classical music. But things have changed. He may have things to talk about. Now, at the end of his talk, we'll be open to the floor for a question and answer session, so the people here can think about some questions they'd like to ask. But I think I'm opening the floor now. It gives me huge pleasure. Let's have a round of applause for Peter Donohoe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's the first time I've been in this building. I have driven past it a couple of times over the years, but I never had a chance to come in, and I'm delighted and to be able to tell you what a wonderful surprise it's been that it's so in London to have a venue like this is so. I know you probably don't imagine you are in London, but you are. And it does feel wonderful. I already feel at home, Hugh, thank you. So, can I come back sometime? The ups and downs of a, what's it called? The ups and downs of a musician's life. Well, I can't pretend I don't like talking about myself. But in a situation like this, I'm a little bit aware that I shouldn't talk for too long about me. Ups and downs. Well, in retrospect and objectively, I don't think there have been many downs. They just feel like downs at the time they happen. I think if I look back, it's been fantastic for me. It's been I started at a wonderful point in the history of music. When I say that, I mean the post-war educational system that people always talk about, the golden era and so on. I was very much part of that. And that encouraged what I do in a way that perhaps is much more difficult now for young musicians. And of course, you know, I made mistakes. I played badly quite often, at least in my estimation I did. Sometimes not so bad. I really meant that seriously. I come off stage, this isn't some kind of false modesty, I come off stage thinking that should have been better. And I know exactly why it should be better and what was not so great. And I think all musicians, if they're honest, will be like that. You can't really come off stage and think, yes, that was it. That was fine. You can come close very occasionally. And there was one concert now a long time ago, 1988, that I did feel was almost as good as it could be from me. I don't know about anyone else, but it was me at my best. And later on, I'm going to ask these gentlemen to play you a clip from that concert. It was a prom in 1988, which seems a very long time ago now. I meant to put some glasses on, and they're back there somewhere, so I'll have to peer. I just want to make sure I don't forget to say things. What I really would like to do later on, when we've listened to the couple of clips that I've prepared, is talk about the music world and the position it's in at the moment, and the position we as musicians and maybe you as audience members, or both, are in relation to the incredible changes that have happened to the world in recent years. I'll not go on about those just for the moment. Just tell you a little bit about me. I was born in 1953, just before the Queen was crowned. I was meant to be just after it. I'm sorry. I was meant to be born on the day she was crowned, but I didn't make it for another 18 days. And then I was very lucky with, first of all, my family and my parents and my school, primary school, absolutely incredibly supportive. The relationship I had with my parents was a bit strange because my father was very, very temperamental, very easily angered, usually by me, but not only by me. And we did not have a very comfortable relationship once at least I became a teenager, because I was not a very nice teenager, I guess. And he died just before I was 21. And he was incredibly supportive, unbelievably, I suppose, ambitious for me. But not in a ruthless way, but he just wanted me to do whatever I chose to do as well as possible. And as I wasn't doing, he shouted at me a lot, and I shouted back. And then he died, and I suppose subconsciously maybe I've been trying to make up for that ever since, by doing exactly what he wanted me to do as well as I think I possibly can. My mother was much more mundane in the best sense, much more feet on the ground. You may have spotted I'm not from the south, and none of my family were either. I think I was the first one in my family to have a passport that I'm aware of, at least my immediate family. And I got that passport in order to do my first foreign date in 1981 in Poland. And my parents and immediate family, they didn't seem to really know what a passport was. And of course it was a communist country at that time, so there was a feeling that I might never come back and all that sort of nonsense that used to happen during the Cold War. It was an extraordinary experience, but I am jumping 30 years, so let's go back a bit. I remember a very supportive group of teachers, and particularly the headmistress at my primary school. And it was a state school, but they were so much behind what I did. And I went on, at their instigation to some degree, I went on at the age of 11 to Chetham's. I'm sure you all know Chetham's School in Manchester. Excuse me. It had been a boys' school since 1653. And in 1969, which was when I entered the sixth form, it became mixed. And it then, which is a bit that maybe people don't know so much about, it was then that it turned into a music specialist school. Before that, it had not been. Pardon me. But the school had supplied the cathedral choir for decades, maybe hundreds of years, I'm not sure, which was literally over the road, and I became part of that. I sang a lot. I was also in a choir that was local to where we lived, which was also in Manchester, only 4 miles away. So I was never a resident. And the singing experience was something that I would recommend to any young musician. Are there any young musicians here? Doesn't really look like it. Sorry. But pass it on if you know any. Singing in particular, but playing other instruments as well, is something that seemed very natural to me at the time, and I was encouraged to do it at first, at any rate, was to have many musical experiences, not just playing the piano. And that stuck with me right through the Chetham's years, when the tendency was to try to persuade us to specialise more. In my primary school era, the fact that I wanted to play other instruments was encouraged. And I'm so grateful for it, because it stuck with me for well, until now, really. I don't do it anymore professionally, but there was a time when I did, and I'm still very much aware of other instruments and the lifestyle of, not the lifestyle, but the working lifestyle of people in orchestras, for example, singers, people in opera companies, a string quartet, and the dreadful problem of transport and making a concert career happen for 4 people. As opposed to 1, which is much easier in a way. Things like that. I think it's very important to be aware of those things, and I've always admired a particular friend of mine whose name you might well know. His name's Andrew Penny. He still lives in the north of England. A very good conductor, a colleague when I was a student, who always emphasised to anyone he knew, and that included me, obviously, how important it was for the conductor of an orchestra to actually know the people intimately well, not just know what the name is, who sweep the stage after the concert, or put the music out, set the orchestra up, do the transport, whatever it may be. And of course there's so many people involved in an orchestral concert. I've nowhere near named them all. There's the librarian, there's the administration, there's etc., marketing, all sorts of things. For the conductor to actually be part of that group, like it's a family, I think is very important, and it's very rare. There's this kind of floating above everyone else tendency that I think they develop because they think other conductors do it, which they do. So it's self-perpetuating. Unfortunately, it also rubs off onto soloists sometimes. And I have to tell you that one of the perpetual issues I've always had as a soloist was arriving, having spent most of my life practicing the piano alone with my wife, unfortunately having to listen to it. Not much contact with many other people on a domestic level, on a domestic basis, and turning up to a rehearsal with an orchestra and being taken into a separate room to the orchestra. And I think, don't you think I spend enough time on my own? What am I supposed to do in here? Well, I've got a coffee machine. Oh, great, thank you. And of course they're doing it because they expect us to do it, because most do. Most seem to think that there is no way they should be mixing with an orchestra. I actually have a vague memory. Does anyone remember Andre Previn's Music Night on the TV? Well, I remember that Andre Previn making the point that he felt that his position as principal conductor, and I think artistic director as well, of the LSO, included knowing all the people in the orchestra really well, and actually not being separated off like that. Not many do it. My friend and colleague, Simon Rattle, absolutely was like that in Birmingham. Tried to be like that in Berlin, but it wasn't quite so welcome, I suspect, because they're slightly different. And is definitely like it again with the LSO, because that's very much part of his personality. The Russian or Soviet conductor with whom I played most enthusiastically was a man called Yevgeny Svetlanov, who was the principal conductor and possibly founder of the USSR State Symphony Orchestra. The most wonderful conductor, I think, well, no, in some ways the most wonderful conductor ever. And the personality was one of a tyrant until he actually rehearsed the orchestra, when he was just wonderful. And when he talked to me about the pieces we were just about to play, didn't speak English really, and I certainly didn't speak Russian, but there was a kind of communication that was very friendly and very welcoming, always. And I'm told by other people at the same time as this is going on, oh, well, Svetlana, of course, he's a KGB colonel and he's unbelievably ruthless and tyrannical. And he was like a teddy bear, actually. And of course, well, if I said that to these people who were warning me against him, they'd say, oh, yes, he's only pretending, though, you know, and so it goes on. The result of that was that all three that we just talked about were wonderful conductors with wonderful results. And I think the same applies to one or two others I could name as well. There's no point in going through a long list of them, but they do exist. The ones who are not like that could be great musicians, they could be fantastic at what they do, but they don't have that connection with the people they're hoping to play the music for them, which is what it amounts to. I'm talking about conducting maybe too much because I'm not really a conductor, although I've done some. But one conductor said once, when I was actually just standing around, I heard him say it to someone else, our job is to allow the players to play well, not to make them play well. And I think that's fantastic. Anyway, enough of that. So whilst I was at primary school, I took an interest in the idea at that stage of playing the violin as well as the piano. I was already playing the piano since I was 4. And they encouraged that, but they didn't have any violins. So I had to wait until I went to Chetham's when it was allowed. Do you think I could have a glass of water? There's a tickle in my throat. Is it possible, please, if you've got any? I'm sure you have got some. So going on to Chetham's, it was encouraged that I would be a violinist in the orchestra. I was very poor, I have to say, and I didn't really practice it. But I'm very glad that I was exposed to it, for sure. I learned how to clean the violin and all that sort of thing. Because it was a very, very good man who taught us music. He was the conductor of the orchestra. He was the head of music for Cheetham's for a long time. And he was a violin, cello and harpsichord maker. His name was Gerald Littlewood. Has anyone ever heard that name? But he was a remarkable individual. And he was very much behind the formation of the music school. Now, we won't go too much into the politics of that because there was another reason why they did it, thank you, which was to avoid becoming comprehensive. Because it was a direct grant school and there was intense pressure on Cheetham. I didn't know this at the time, of course, I'd never even heard the word, but there was intense pressure of them to change to being a comprehensive school. And they avoided it by essentially emulating the Menuhin school, which is in Cobham, I believe. And I've got this vague memory, well, it's not so vague, of being asked to play the piano just as Menuhin was being shown around the school, to happen to be in a practice room. And I remember him coming through. I didn't speak to him, but I remember him being there and looking vaguely approving as he went by. And it was to come and look over our attempts to do what he'd already done in the south, which, you know, looking back in retrospect, it's very courageous and very difficult to pull off with that political pressure. It's a fantastic school now. I think what they're doing for young musicians is quite miraculous. It went through a bit of teething trouble, which coincided with me. The first 2 years of the music school's existence was my sixth form, essentially, before I went off to university, and they were quite difficult. That was one of the downs. But now it's a wonderful place. I go back every summer or almost every summer to do the summer school that's on in that same building. When I say I do the summer school, I'm not a pupil yet, or anymore, I should say. So, from the violin, it was decided that there were too many violins in the school orchestra. Most of us weren't very good anyway. A couple were very good, but I wasn't one of those. And that they needed some violas. So I took up the viola. And I think I didn't mention Gerald Littlewood made violas as well as cellos and all that. Brilliant man, really. So I played one of his homemade violas, which was known as a Tertis model, very much larger than most violas. But the most significant thing about that was that it plays the inner parts of whatever music, most of the time anyway, whatever music it's playing, the viola is playing the middle, and it's playing with the alto clef, which for most musicians who haven't studied the alto clef when they're young is a very difficult clef to read because it's a seventh out from the other clefs. And I'm so grateful that I just know the alto clef so instinctively. In a way, by the way, that I don't know the tenor clef. I have to transpose that, but the alto clef I know the notes straight away, which is very useful if you conduct anything. Incredibly useful. And being aware of the inner parts as well is also part of the musical training, essentially, although it wasn't intended particularly, but it became part of my development. And then I decided that I wanted to be a drummer. Don't ask me why. I sort of know why, and I'm very glad I did it, but I don't know what initiated it at the time. It wasn't that it was easier, because it isn't. Perhaps it was that every note a percussion player plays is a solo, and I think that's what really got to me, subconsciously. Whereas if you play the violin in an orchestra, it's very rarely a solo unless you're the leader. And the viola certainly not. You know, it's just a totally different way of playing music, I suppose, because you have to be part of a team in the way that a percussion player doesn't really have to be. You are on your own. Most conductors don't understand what you're doing anyway. I'm saying most, not all. Most of them don't even look at the percussion part in the score. They're concentrating all the time on the first violin section. And it is one of my bête noire to go and do my first rehearsal with a conductor to find that the rostrum has been turned left, facing the violins. Because it means the cellos are behind the conductor and all the people at the back are just kind of forgotten, really. Woodwind and so on. And so they have to basically work as a big chamber group together. And this is going on here, you see. They obviously don't all do that, and the ones who don't make orchestras sound far better, or allow them to start to sound far better, I should say. So that was very much part of my development, was to have, probably in my case, I was keener on playing all those instruments than I ever was on the piano at the time. I tried the clarinet, that was an absolute, total dismal failure, as was the tuba. But I'm very glad I gave it a go anyway. And the organ, of course, other keyboard instruments. The reason the piano was kind of sidelined for a while, and it was only for a while really, was that it involves so much hard work. There's so much music, and it's very hard, most of it. And you have to be alone all the time. The great thing about orchestras is that you're not alone. There is camaraderie. It's like being in the army. There's a huge, not that I know about that, but there's a huge number of stories that you can tell about things that happen with all these other friends you have. And there are lots of practicalities that are actually great fun, particularly for a percussion player. So I look back on those years with huge affection. And it went on until, I suppose, well, I did my university course and then I went to the RNCM in Manchester. And I suppose around the last year of that, it just faded because I'd become a pianist properly then. Decided to really put all my eggs in that basket finally, having been, they were trying to persuade me to do that for years on end. And because I was a kind of rebel, not anymore of course, but I was a kind of rebel in those days, I kind of soft pedalled it all the time, if you'll excuse the pun. But then the percussion work, which was a professional activity, I was earning quite a lot of money actually, which I wasn't as a pianist, which set me in very good stead, because I bought a piano with it in the end. But the percussion work was, it was, as I'm sure you probably realise, if you're an extra percussion player, as opposed to being on a contract with an orchestra, it includes all kinds of strange activities, like setting the cannons off in the 1812 overture, or playing the wind machine, or all kinds of weird things that you end up doing. It's not just playing the triangle, or the timpani, or the xylophone. There's all this other stuff. And I love doing all that, up to a point. I think I probably have got bored by now if I carried on, but at that time it was a fantastic experience. It also included playing the keyboards in the orchestra. In fact, I gravitated to that. Piano solo, I'm sorry, not solo, piano in the orchestra, celeste, harpsichord, organ, and so on. And the Halley Orchestra were booking me. You know, the Halley Orchestra is Manchester's main private orchestra, as opposed to the BBC, which is obviously not private. They were booking me on a regular basis, and they asked me to play the solo piano part in Stravinsky's Petrushka on one occasion, which is actually almost a concerto, only for a little while. The ballet has this, I'm sure you all know it anyway, but it has this solo piano part that's really quite difficult to play. And I did that, and just afterwards, it appears in retrospect, they had a discussion as to who they would ask to play the Paganini Rhapsody of Rachmaninoff in the opening concert of the summer proms. That's in Manchester, not the London proms. It's the Halley proms. Sorry about this. And they decided on the basis of this Petrushka that they'd ask me. And it was James Loughran had conducted the Petrushka, and he was going to conduct the prom as well. And so I got offered this engagement to play a piece I didn't actually know, the Paganini Rhapsody of Rachmaninoff. It was about 6 months' notice, and I pretended I knew it, of course. And learned it in the 6 months, which, you know, it's a very hard piece. I think it's one of the most difficult pieces in the popular repertoire. But I loved it, absolutely adored the piece, and I really I was terribly, terribly nervous. But at the same time, I really loved those 2 concerts they'd offered me with James Lochran, being very supportive, very good conductor, very, very nice man, actually. It was extraordinary, just because it did go well, and it led to all the other orchestras I was working with as a player in the orchestra asking me to do things, short notice things very often. And I became Mr. Super Sub for a bit. You know, whenever anybody fell ill, I was, yeah, I know that piece. And it just developed in a way that I couldn't have really dreamt of before. It didn't include London, which for a northerner is always an issue. It's pretty well an issue for people from London as well, by the way. But we always looked up to London in those days, particularly in those days, as the place to aim for, either to live in and work your way up because you were there geographically, or somewhere to play. What I did do was play the gong in Shostakovich's 10th Symphony at the Festival Hall. That was my Festival Hall debut, with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic doing their annual visit to London. That was when I first played here, and it was very frightening. I don't know why it's so frightening for us northerners, but it seemed it. Just, you know, the Festival Hall, amazing. But that was in 1975. I've grown up a bit since then. So, it didn't include London in a way that gave me a bit of a complex about that. I'm thinking, why is the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra and the RLPO and the CBSO and all these other orchestras, why is it doing so well there, but not in London? And I never really found out, but I did break into it in the end, which you may know. Then I went to Paris after leaving the RNCM in Manchester. I went to Paris to study composition and performance with Yvonne Loriot, who was the wife of Olivier Messian. And the reason for that was entirely because I loved Messiaen's music so much. Now, he's a bit of a Marmite composer, isn't he, Messian? It's very difficult to find anyone who can take it or leave it. You either absolutely adore it, which I did, or you can't stand it. Quite a few colleagues of mine don't really understand why I like it. I just think it's the most fantastic music, and I did this sort of amateurish. I had that impression that if I wanted to play Messiaen better, then who would be better than his wife? And of course, it doesn't work that way, actually. First of all, she didn't really want to teach her husband's music. I discovered later that she was really fed up with the fact that she was regarded as a specialist in her husband's music just because they were married, which I think is something the marketing industry is very guilty of, that kind of thing. I'll give you a little quote from Yvonne. It was in French, of course, but I did speak French. She said, though in English, I'll do it in English, she said, if you ever want to be regarded, in fact she already knew I did, if you would wish to be regarded as a versatile musician, don't marry a composer. I wasn't intending to, but because as soon as she did, you see, the fact that she played the piano wonderfully, she played Chopin and Schumann, because she recorded quite a lot of Schumann before they got married. Debussy, Ravel, almost inevitably. And I think she did the complete piano keyboard works of Mozart, which is a lot of music. She did all that on record, and then she married Messiaen. And suddenly, not a single invitation was coming in for her that wasn't his music. That's the danger of marketing, sadly. And she was obviously very upset about it. And I don't really know what his position on that was. I mean, she was a great pianist, and I'm sure he loved the way she played it. Well, it was wonderful. And he was an incredibly decent man. Just maybe the most generous-spirited person I've ever met, actually. And if he was here now, you'd all love him. You might hate his music, but you love him because he was such a great person. I don't mean fun person, I just mean on such a high spiritual level. We talked quite a lot in the way we could, which was in French, which is not great on my part, but I did get the gist about the role of a musician and of music in society. That was one of his obsessions, was to know why we do it, what the point of this is. Now, the thing is about that, it was already an issue. Why do we do it? You know, it was already going to be sidelined in schools. It was on its way out as far as school kids were concerned, already in the 70s. What Messian would have thought of the present day, God knows. Because we don't really have an easily spotted role as musicians anymore, other than to have a career. That's all we do it for now. When I say we, I'm too old to think like that, but I think most people think, let's go into music. It might make us famous, make lots of money. And not much more than that. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but they will find it very difficult to pedal uphill or against the prevailing wind of it just being a career, wanting to be well known. I don't know how you deal with it, and I'm really sorry about this cough. But anyway, that was when I set off on my slightly extra musical thinking path. Thinking about the world and politics and how we fit in, why we should be bothered, why should we be able to get money from the government to do what we do when nobody outside a certain area of society is actually interested in the slightest in it. Why does an orchestra expect to receive a lot of subsidy when the hospitals are short of kidney machines, or that kind of conflict? I used to think about it in a huge amount, and I never really got to the bottom of it. It never occurred to me, for one thing, that the obvious fact that most of what we play, that we call classical music, is from Western Europe. Some from Eastern Europe and, of course, Russia. But that's it. The vast majority of what we do was written also at a time when Europe dominated the world. All the empires, Belgium, Holland, France, Britain, all over the world. And I did read the book at the time. It's called Music, Education and Society by Roger Small, I think his name was. I'm not actually sure about that, but I read it in the late 70s. And I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I now do. I see exactly what he meant, which is that the whole of our Western music that we all love and spend whole, not just as a job, but whole lifetime studying and hoping to get better, was actually written at a time when Europe was what's the right word? Colonising? I can't think of the word. Colonising, that'll do. Huge parts of the world, and not really being terribly nice to them on the whole. And therefore, we have this situation where the people from all those colonies, who've now got their countries back, on the whole, would rather like to reject the music that came with us. Just a thought. I don't know where you go with it, though. That's the trouble. I don't know. Well, you know, we have things like people, for example, people from other racial groups joining the music world, the classical music world. And they're very welcome to do so, as far as I'm concerned. It's fantastic that they can. They come and they learn Western European music. Therefore, the people who come from the same racial groups as they do tend to think that they're traitors. And I don't know what we do with that. I don't know the endless protests, particularly in universities, about the way we are an elite and we play music that is from an elite part of history. What do they want us to do? That's the thing that I'd like to know. It's all very well being negative about it, but what do they actually want? Somebody who's spent several decades trying to perfect the art, what do they want us to do now? It's a very interesting subject, I think, and one that we must, as musicians, we must be aware of the rest of the world, what goes on around us. For example, the destruction of statues of slave traders. Is there any end to this? Because, of course, it's a very evil past in many ways. And a lot of this music comes from that past. I don't know quite what I'm supposed to do about it, that's the only thing. It's a little bit like a young German feeling guilty about what his grandfather did in the war. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, I really don't. Messian was the first person to make me aware of that kind of thing. In, 1978, I think it was, something like that. And then from then on, I came back. I reaped the reward of what he taught me, or she taught me as well. And I loved contemporary music. I liked the fact that it shocked people. When I was a drummer, I wanted to be in a rock band because it shocked people. I loved music by people like Peter Maxwell Davies because it shocked people. Well, in fact, Stravinsky shocked people, never mind Peter Maxwell Davies. So, you know, there was an element in me of the sort of eternal rebel, the contrarian. And looking back at it in retrospect, I now realise that, first of all, it wasn't the only music I knew, because I started out with Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven and Schubert in particular. Not so much the Romantics, but those composers I loved when I was at school. And I played a lot of it, but not publicly, because I didn't feel I was able to play it. Whereas Bartók, Stravinsky, Messian, of course, a little bit later, and Schoenberg and so on and so on, all the 20th century, Shostakovich, Prokofiev, all those great 20th century composers, I felt much closer to. Well, of course, I was close to them. We all are. They're more recent. But I really loved the content of the music as well. And what I now realise in retrospect is part of that is that you know what they want. You know exactly what those composers want you to play. There's no choice. Well, there is a bit, but most of the time it's very, very detailed scoring. Everything is written down so brilliantly by incredibly great composers, it seems to me, most of those guys. And very conscientious. Very conscientiously written down, is what I really mean to say. So, and that, of course, if you think about it, is because they didn't really trust us performers. Prior to the First World War, shall we say, or certainly prior to the mid-19th century, the vast majority of composers would be astounded to know that we played their music now, because they expected that was just something they wrote while they were alive. And in the case of Bach or Mozart, it was for next weekend, and then, you know, here we are playing this incredible music, but they didn't expect it. I'm sure they didn't, but because they used to play it themselves. They didn't expect anyone else to play it. That was their thing. When you get to, let's say, Liszt, maybe more than any other, Liszt played music by other composers, maybe for the first time in any big way. He adored the music of other composers. And it's quite fashionable, I think, to talk about Liszt as if he was a bit of a clown or a sort of circus act, because he had such a fantastic technique. Evidently, we can't hear any of it, but he was just so naturally blessed with the most amazing fingers and fantastic sort of performance ability, projection, communication, and was regarded as really almost a devil, because he was so, well, you probably know, he was expected, he was regarded, I should say, as someone who had the kind of satanistic, Mephistophelian personality, like Paganini did on the violin. But he used to encourage other composers more than any other that I've ever heard of, I think. To encourage Chopin and Schumann and Grieg and Fauré even, when he was a very old man. All kinds of, and Wagner, famously, because Wagner was his son-in-law. Did we all know that? Wagner was Liszt's son-in-law. The most extraordinary relationship they must have had. But anyway, and Wagner, I mean, to be honest, I think Wagner was a really atrocious composer until that time. And then suddenly he became this great, one of the greatest ever. Slightly megalomaniac, it has to be said. But you know, in fact, just talking of Wagner, I was persuaded some years back to play a sonata by Wagner that he'd written when he was very young. Absolute garbage. Absolutely dreadful. And I don't say that easily about anything, because I couldn't have written it. But it's the fact that you're playing this stuff and it says Richard Wagner. I mean, it doesn't quite compute, because if you know Goethe Dammerung, you think, well, how is this possible? This piece of utter tripe. And that, of course, predated his relationship with Liszt, who had this profound influence on his harmonies, on his sense of his role, I guess, same as Messian and me. I mean, Wagner was, I think, probably intending to change the world. In some ways he did. He certainly changed the music world. And it came very largely from this generosity. I think that's a very important point, because that obviously spread in the next generation. And composers started to feel that, this was the downside of it, started to feel that the performers were going away from what they'd written too much. So they started overwriting their scores. And you end up with the most extraordinary detail in a piece, for example, by Elgar. And of course, he didn't write much piano music. But Elgar's scores are so detailed, it's unbelievable. Richard Strauss, Mahler, and all of that generation, really. You can tell exactly what they want if you're just prepared to actually believe what they've written down, as opposed to interpreting it. That was for me much easier than playing earlier music. Even though I knew the earlier music pretty well, I felt very nervous of it. I entered 4 competitions in my life and didn't win the first 3. And the 4th one was the one in Moscow, 1982. And I didn't really win that either, but I did all right. And of course, when you enter a country like that, none of which exists anymore, actually. The Soviet Union was unique, particularly musically, by the way. It was a little bit like entering the lion's den, I suppose. Throwing down the gauntlet and to some degree believing all the propaganda I'd been fed since I was a child about the Soviets. And it was the most incredible experience I think I've ever had musically, to go there and encounter that, the reality of that musical system there. Not without its faults, certainly not without its faults politically and historically, but the actual music scene was just unbelievable. And unique. It's all gone now, completely disappeared. Why am I on this subject? I can't remember. Have I jumped? Have I missed anything out? Oh yeah, well, all I was going to say was that was when I really got into politics, I suppose, because I went to see the reality of the Soviet system and its relationship to music and the music world, which was absolutely fundamental to the whole music world. It was the core of everything that my generation did, particularly on the piano or the solo violin, maybe conducting, certainly, and the cello, certainly those instruments. The Soviet example was what really made us achieve what we did, because we had to compete with it. Even if we didn't realise it, that was what was going on. Shall we talk a little bit about competitions before we hear the clip? Okay, well, I've been on several juries since then. I don't want to go on about this for hours, which I could, but I have been on several juries since 1982, particularly in the 90s and onwards. They had a really poor reputation when I was younger of being unfair, prejudiced. And of course the obvious one was the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow, which was only founded in 1958. And I think the one night I went to was the 7th. And they're probably up to 13 by now, I imagine. Oh, you'll not do well there. There's only Russians that will get anywhere in that. It was constant, this sort of propaganda. So then I thought, well, Van Cliburn won it. He was from Texas. That was 1958. John Ogden shared the gold medal with Ashkenazi. John Lill won it in 1970. Terence Judd did very well in it a little bit later than that, well, 8 years later. Freddie Kemp did well a little bit after that. And then there was me. And then subsequent to that, there was Barry Douglas, which was actually after the political change, which I don't know whether there's any connection, but that was 1 year after Gorbachev and all the things started to change rapidly, really. So I began to think, well, actually, this is just pure prejudice. They've done really well by the British, haven't they? You know, I mean, I don't know whether... I'm sure that most of you do remember the Soviet Union and the Cold War and all the stuff that was said about it. Well, regarding whether or not the results were controlled by the government, Emil Gilels was the chairman of the jury in 1958, and they had this meeting. In those days, they used to discuss results, which they're not allowed to do anymore, but they used to discuss around the table what they should do. And they all, according to what Gilels wrote later, they all unanimously agreed that the best one was Van Cliburn, the American, 1958. Can you imagine the relationship between the Soviets and the US at that time? The best one's the American. Oh, what are we going to do? And they didn't allow the first prize to go to a Soviet. And actually, the Soviet, I can't remember his name, but the Soviet entrant who did well was very good anyway. So it was a little bit like this. But Gilels felt the urge to talk to Khrushchev about it so that he could get government approval for the result, and had a meeting in the Kremlin. And Khrushchev said, apparently, who was quite a nice man, I think, he said, well, is he the best? Is he really the best? I mean, we have the best system here. This is the greatest country in the world. But yes, he is the best. Oh, well, give him the prize then. Which, of course, was the beginning, which actually was why Khrushchev created the competition in the first place. It was the beginning of détente, really. Do you remember the word détente? It was the beginning. It went through a few slightly hairy moments, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. But basically, they wanted to make friends, I think. At least he did. His predecessor didn't, Stalin. He didn't. No, that was another matter and another era, which politically I think is a very important part of the Soviet history, is that each decade was totally different to the one before it. So we have to be very careful about thinking of was it 70 years it existed for? We mustn't think of that history all being the same. It did change a lot. And I think Khrushchev was the one who changed the most. And he created this competition. I've just had a vision of Boris Johnson creating a piano competition in order to get relationship with France better. No. Just an aside, really, because I do get waylaid by talking about Russia, really, because it's so much against what people instinctively imagine. But in the 2011 Tchaikovsky competition, which was the one Daniil Trifonov won, I was on the jury. The interpreters for the jury members, in other words, different linguists, came from the University of Moscow. I think it's called the Lenin University, or it certainly was. And their teacher, their English teacher, was the daughter of somebody called Bulganin, who was one of Khrushchev's ministers. And of course, very sociable. We ended up in her apartment. Actually, so did Van Cliburn, because he was a guest of the competition in 2011. And we had this most fantastic, open conversation about the way things used to be. It was really wonderful. And there was a picture of Khrushchev on the wall, dandling a little baby, which was her. I mean, you know, of course they're going to do that. You remember the Sting song that goes, "The Russians love their children too"? Oh, of course they do. You know, but we had this vague impression somehow that they were different, that they were just by nature evil and not very nice at all, and ruthless. They are a bit ruthless, it has to be said, and they're bullies. Sorry if there are any Russians here. It's a bullying nation, and they have bullying people, but that's because they're childlike, and people who are childlike do tend to bully sometimes. They don't really think of the long-term future, I think that's the truth about it. That's what I learned about them more than anything. They think of now. I want it now, and you're in the way. You know, it's a little bit like that. And of course, by no means all of them. And certainly not Svetlana, by the way. He was absolutely not like that. So, I entered the competition. By the way, my diary from 1982 competition is available online. I wrote a diary every day. I think Hugh's seen that. Am I right in it?
It's on the social media.
Yeah, right. Because there's nothing else to do. Because that was actually the downside of being in the Soviet Union. There was nothing to do except practice the piano. Maybe that was why they were so good at it. But there was nothing at all. No kind of entertainment, no party time, no nightlife. Just work and bad food, dreadful food. That's of course, I'm sorry, I keep talking about Russia. The dreadful food and the queuing at the shops, which we probably all remember, that was because it's a gigantic country and they couldn't distribute very well because they couldn't organise very well. So the food wasn't in the shops. And of course we translated that into the government depriving the population. Why you do that of your population? Isn't that rather risking a revolution? You know, but anyway, if you went to a small town in the provinces, the food was fabulous. But it wasn't in Moscow. It was dreadful, particularly for the competition entrance. Yeah, there was nothing much to do, so I wrote a diary, that's right. Nothing much to do at all. I did a lot of practice, maybe more than at any other time in my life, actually, daily. Because the competition was 5 weeks long, or 4 weeks actually, but there was a week after the result of prize winners' concerts and so on. I just didn't expect to get to the second round, and I didn't expect to get to the third round. There were only 3 anyway at the time, and I was gobsmacked that I did. And of course you could say, well, why did you enter if you didn't think you'd make it? But there's just the possibility that you might, you see. And I did. And they were fantastic. What went on in the jury, God knows, but I'll never find out now. Most of them are not on the planet anymore, I'm afraid. So there's no way that I can know the discussions. And it wasn't minuted, very carefully, avoided all that. But they came through with the result that I would get the silver medal jointly with the Russian entrant, who came to Britain to win the Leeds competition in 1987 by the name of Vladimir Ovchinnikov. We shared in 82 in Moscow, and there was no gold medal. And I've never found out quite what the reason for that was, but that's what they came up with. So the clip that we're just about to see is the end of the third Rachmaninoff concerto, which I did in the final. And the reason for showing this isn't to show what a brilliant performance it was, because actually I don't like it anymore. When I look at it now, it's too fast and too youthful. I was 29. But I think it's the atmosphere that I'd like to demonstrate, the Moscow atmosphere of that, particularly the competition, but any kind of concert actually. Because music, maybe the arts generally, but certainly music was like a religion to the Soviet public, because they didn't have religion. They weren't officially allowed it. So they turned to the arts, or sport, or science, or some kind of vocation, and became world leaders in almost everything that was like that. Great orchestras, wonderful conductors. I mean, of course, there were some duff ones as well, but that's, you know, the level was high. And the main thing is the educational level of the public, the degree to which they understood music, understood what you were doing, particularly in Russian music, of course, because that was like because they're so proud of their own culture in a way that we can't even imagine in the UK, because we're totally unproud of ours. The people there felt somehow that it was a compliment that you came and played their music. And it's a little bit like, well, let's see what angle this Westerner is going to have on our music. You know, maybe slightly sceptically at first, but if you do it okay, they're very happy with it. And that happened to Ogden and John Lill and everyone who went. The same story, really. So this was Rachmaninoff's third concerto, which was the second concerto I played in the final, because you were required then to play 2. with a 5-minute break between them. Tchaikovsky was a given because of the competition name and the fact that he was a national hero. And the Rachmaninoff second came immediately after it. The thing that you have to realise about that, of course, more than anything, and I hadn't even thought of it myself, was that you've got to rehearse it. And the orchestra is up to here with rehearsing Tchaikovsky 1 because there were 13 finalists, you see. So I think almost everyone played Tchaikovsky 1, and the orchestra were a little bit fed up with playing it. I had to rehearse the orchestra essentially in the Rachmaninoff because the conductor was so tired. And this was the result. This is the final few minutes of the concerto. But watch out for the audience and their involvement.
Very good. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So good. Congratulations. Yes, wonderful. Superb. Superb. Thank you very much. Back into work.
Well, I play at about half the speed of that now. It is too fast, I have to say, very much so. But then it didn't seem it at the time, and that is one of the. I was going to say this if there were any young pianists here. One of the most important lessons to learn as a young artist, particularly on the piano. And maybe particularly if you're male, actually. I think girls are probably much better at this than we are. The degree to which the tempo of what you do seems a lot slower as you're playing it to the way it seems to the listener. And of course, if you're tense, like in the finals of a competition in the Soviet Union, it's going to be. I mean, that just sounded absurd to me, but and always did, to be honest. But I was playing it much more quickly than I thought I was doing. Simple as that. The conductor was having a bit of a. I was leading him a dance, really. He was, by the way, he was a fairly young on the scene at the time in Russia. He was a new conductor, but he was doing very well, and he's still conducting now. And I mean, maybe I shouldn't really say this, but I suppose I've got to now. About 2 minutes into that clip, he loses me totally, and he's on the wrong beat. And I've always looked at this moment in the Rachmaninoff third, thinking, well, most conductors could probably deal with most of the piece. It's not such a problem, particularly if you're clear. But that is a very difficult moment. It goes from a very slow passage, and suddenly there's an avalanche of very quiet notes. It's 9 bars after 56, in case you want to look it up. He lost me, and I made up for it by adding 8 notes, I think, because he ended up a beat behind. So I added 8 notes, so he caught up with me. Which you can only do that if you know the piece quite well. Which sounded facetious, but actually I'd played it probably 12, 13 times before going there. So I did know it very. If your first performance is in a competition, that's a big important subject. If you've never played with an orchestra before and you're in a piano competition, all kinds of things happen that you can't possibly anticipate. And I could anticipate it, I suppose. I was very lucky in that respect. And about, what would it be, 7 or 8 years ago, I was invited to do a tour around the UK with a Russian orchestra with this conductor. We'd not met since the competition. He was very nice. And we did Rachmaninoff's third. And he said, did you know that this performance of ours in Moscow has been put out on a CD now? I still get it wrong, he said. I said, well, it was fine. The atmosphere was so fantastic, and the sound of the orchestra, which doesn't really come across on the Soviet TV come YouTube clip, but the sound of the orchestra was amazing, just incredibly crisp and committed, which is wonderful. We got to the very same place in the concert in Leeds Town Hall, and he lost me. He lost me again in exactly the same place. And I think it was probably about the 170th performance I'd given of the piece, and it never happened with anyone else. But it's a blind spot. It's something he was desperately worried about. So it happened again. You know the feeling. And he was very funny about it afterwards again, which is fine by me. Great. But the main point of showing that was nothing to do with my playing, by the way. I have to say that, because I'm not particularly impressed with it. Excuse me. I'm not impressed with that. If I was on the jury, I'd think, well, he needs to slow down a bit, breathe occasionally. But it was the atmosphere of the concert, particularly the end, of course, but the atmosphere in that hall is impossible impossible to see it on there really, but it is just extraordinary, and it still is to some degree. I've been on the jury twice, as I mentioned before, in the same hall since then, and it's a fantastic public, a fantastic commitment to music that maybe will gradually die away because they have eliminated music from schools in the way that we have. And the main reason they were ahead of the game was because they were so disciplined in schools over music. And I suppose the political implication that you needed to be as good at whatever you chose to do as you possibly could for your country, which was what it was really all about, that's gone, of course. So I don't want to sound like somebody moaning in an old people's home, but you know, things have changed to such a degree, and I want to see something replace it. I want to see maybe if China will, but it could do. Supposedly a communist country, but not really. It could happen though, for sure. Just that the spirit in China is, and the interest in Western music is so extraordinary and very hard to explain. If you know Chinese music and you try to relate them, I don't understand how they can be so good at what we do. Because they are. On the whole, the level is incredibly high. And vast numbers of them as well, as you probably know. I've been to China fairly recently, so I know what it's like there. And really, there are huge numbers of pianists, and some of them are very good. Really very good. And when I said to the head of the keyboard department in Beijing Conservatory, you know, we've just heard it on the BBC, which we had, that there are 45 million people in China who play the piano. How they count them, I'm not sure, but that's what it said. He said, "Oh, I suppose you think that's a big part of the population, do you?" Well, it isn't. It's 2.5% approximately. And actually, I think the UK maybe in the 60s or so was about the same. Just with an awful lot less population in the first place. But yes, it's an extraordinary experience because when you play in China, the most unbelievable things do happen. Incredible things. The audience behaviour is probably the worst in the world. But the interest in the music somehow is fantastic, and they come backstage by the hundreds, and they just and also the age group is very low. So it's really wonderful. So they're doing something right. I've been teaching quite a lot in classes. I only do master classes, but of course these days, another big subject, but these days, we won't need to go into that, but these days the vast majority of colleges in more or less any Western country, and certainly in this country, are dominated by Chinese students. It used to be Korean, prior to that it was Japanese, and now it's China. And I honestly, without a word of a lie, something like 4 days ago I did a masterclass at the Birmingham Conservatoire, I'm sorry, they speak French in Birmingham apparently. I think it was 5 people who played to me. Big pieces, very well. All of them were Chinese, all 5 of them. And there are British students there. There are Russian students even. They didn't play. All Chinese. Now, what does that mean? I don't really know. It's something to do with the Chinese affluence, I think, and the fact that they can afford to send so many or come to the UK to study, or America, or Australia, wherever they go, all of those places. But it's also to do with their discipline from being this high. And their finger work is just extraordinary, particularly the way that they can do intricate things on the piano. It's maybe just some kind of national tendency that their fingers are just so extraordinarily efficient, and the work that goes into it as well. But I think it's worth saying that I actually believe that in the end, musical style, and I've learned this really in recent years, musical style and the way to project great, particularly romantic and classical music, is to be aware of the voice and the style of the voice, not the sound of it, but the style of it, the rhythmic style of it, and the breathing, and all the things that singing requires you to do. And intrinsic to that is language. So Western European languages, lieder and opera and so on. Of course they do. And the way we play, for example, Mozart on the piano is so obviously influenced by the way he wrote opera. And if you play in the style of the voice in the opera on the piano, it's really what the music is about. And if your main language is Mandarin, that is a difficult thing to get over, but it's not impossible. And some of them do it fantastically well. Because Mandarin doesn't sound anything like a Western European language in any way at all. There is no connection. It's just another world altogether, as indeed is Chinese folk music, of course, and even music that's regarded as more serious than folk music. There is a wonderful contemporary pianist, and every single person here will know who I mean, Lang Lang, who is Chinese, brought up in Beijing but studied in America, and has become maybe the most prolific international superstar on the piano in the world at the moment, who I know him a little, not well, but I've met him a couple of times, and I must say, you know, the way that he can play the piano makes me wonder what Liszt was really like, because there is nothing that he can't play. It's just so unbelievably efficient and maybe naturally efficient as opposed to the result of hard work, or maybe both. I don't really know. But I do know that you could never present him with anything that gave him any difficulties. And most of the piano world has a down on him, maybe because he's so successful, maybe because he's Chinese, maybe because he's something of a showman, and he certainly used to be when he was younger. I think that's gone away a little bit because he's grown up, you know. And this easy success he's had is partly because of all those things. But it's also the confidence that the guy has is just extraordinary, because, you know, confidence is everything on the stage, as opposed to arrogance. Knowing that what you're going to do is going to work is where we all aim for. And I think he was probably born with that ability, just because it relaxes everything in your arms. As a matter of fact, the other day, just talking about arms, I tried to practice something that I'm playing in a couple of days' time at home. And I was feeling very tense at the time. And the reason was a news item, which we don't need to go into, but there's an appalling news item on at the moment about a little boy being tortured to death. And I went to the piano, and because of it, I think it's because of the news item, I was very stiff in my arms. And I tried to play the piece that I'm playing in a couple of days' time, a concerto. And it was awful. The sound I was making was just dreadful, harsh and without resonance and without any line, and I couldn't change it. And I've sort of realised, maybe even more now since then, because the day before it wasn't like that, that actually the fact that I was feeling tense was really what was causing it. And back to Lang Lang, he doesn't feel tense about anything. It's just fun. Everything's fun for him. And he plays with the most wonderful instinct for singing style, Western European singing style, like everything's a song. It's no wonder he's so successful. Apart from the business opportunities he provides for Sony in China, because Sony isn't Chinese, of course, it's Japanese, and they don't have a good relationship. So he's taking Sony to China, and he's taking Steinway to China as well, with a new concert hall once a week, wanting some pianos. So he is a fantastic business opportunity, but he's also a wonderful pianist, and actually a very, very nice person. So I just thought, I'm not his agent, by the way, but I just thought I'd mention. So the future of music, I've said here. Well, China seems to be where the future of music is at the moment, doesn't it? What about the UK? What about the fact that when I do the Cheetham Summer School, or in particular when I'm on a competition jury, there are virtually no British entrants. They don't exist they may exist in the Leeds competition because that's British. But actually, I knew Fanny Waterman quite well towards the end of her life. And she was saying that the number of British people entering the Leeds competition was getting less and less all the time. I think it's probably improved since she died, actually. That sounded awful. I didn't mean that at all. I didn't mean that juxtaposition, but I think there are more now, for some reason. But Geneva competition, for example, the Tchaikovsky competition, which I was on the jury for, and all sorts of others that were much smaller in stature, I suppose. The Italian competition, I was the chairman of the jury there. There was nobody from this country. Where are they all? Why aren't they entering? People say, oh, well, it's because they didn't publicise the competition very well. Well, they seem to manage it in other countries. Why didn't, you know, what's going on? Because we had this wonderful, particularly on the piano, wonderful musical tradition. We also had it in the voice. We had great conductors, wonderful orchestras from all over the UK. Why is it such a problem to get people to be interested anymore? I don't understand. I mean, I don't want to make a big thing of this, but there are no pianists here, are there? Today. Where are they? Do they come? They come to play. They don't come to listen. That I think, in a nutshell, is the problem. They want to have a career, they want to play, but they don't want to actually listen to anyone else. And I think it's extremely important to be able to do that. I have to say that I had a season ticket to the Harley Orchestra. It didn't matter what they were playing, and it was very often without a piano, of course. And twice a week I used to go there and watch every concert, and there were others as well. And it's very important to go and hear what it's like for other people to do concerts. Even if it's not very good, you learn more from that maybe than you do if it is very good. So I hope that changes. And as I just mentioned, when I was in China, which is now, I think, 4 times, didn't matter where I went, and some of the places were very isolated and towns that you won't have heard of, and very unpleasant towns in some cases, but the audiences were always full of young people. One of the biggest secrets of all, I think. I'm halfway down my list of topics. And I can't even read some of it, I'm sorry. Yes, indeed. We had a lockdown, didn't we? And we're just about to enter another one, I think. September 2020 was between the 2 initial lockdowns, wasn't it? And that was the last time I played with an orchestra, was September 2020. And I'm just about to do so again, as I mentioned, a couple of days. I'm wondering what the interval is going to do to me. It's a very important point that the routine of going the whole day of a concert and going on stage and playing becomes automatic to some degree. Not the music, but the routine. And I'm wondering if the lockdown, to a lot of people, has actually broken that routine. It probably has, to some degree. I mean, I'm very interested in my own response to it. It's actually a recording, so there's no audience, but all the same, it's an orchestra. In between times, though, I've been doing quite a lot of chamber music and lots of recordings of my own, solo piano recitals, discs. That's different, of course, because you're on your own. And 1 or 2 public events as well. And hasn't it been fantastic in a way? It's been appalling in other ways. Obviously, the virus is just diabolical. And the things it's done to people are just dreadful. And the way it's become politicised is embarrassing as well. But when promoters, most of whom just gave up, when they actually were determined to put something on and to go ahead with something that had been agreed to from before the virus came along, obviously they had to modify the presentation, usually a smaller number of chairs, further apart, all those sort of things. Very careful with the interval and the refreshments and toilets and all the rest of it. It's all very difficult for them, but some of them have actually done it, and the result is just such a great atmosphere. Slightly reminiscent of that one that we just watched. It's like we're all pulling together in a way that perhaps is impossible to reproduce when we don't have a pandemic. So that was an incredible learning curve. I was at home more or less all the time, of course, in a way that I never used to be. I was doing an average of 4 concerts a week before the pandemic. It wasn't always 4, but sometimes it was 5, and other times it was 3. But on the whole, it was around that. And what was I going to say? I can't remember. Lockdown. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's right. I did find it quite difficult, although I managed it in those earlier days. I did manage to learn a lot of new music. I learned quickly, so that wasn't totally impossible. But during the lockdown, of course, I've had this chance to do all kinds of other things that I'd never played before, and to some degree never dared play before. But just as a single example, is the Songs Without Words of Mendelssohn, which as a child I absolutely loved. In fact, everything of Mendelssohn. I don't know, there's something about his music that I absolutely adored when I was a kid. The famous Andante and Rondo Capriccioso, well, the Andante only actually, was my grandparents' favourite piece, and I can remember them trying to get me to play it. I didn't go beyond into the Rondo Capriccioso, but the Andante I did play as a very small child. And then I heard the concertos. I love those. They're kind of underrated, regarded as rather lightweight, but I don't think they are really. Excuse me. And that is such an incredible learning curve, that music, because the whole issue of making the piano sing in a song without words, it's obviously what it's about. And it's partly the sound you make on the melody line, and it's also very much the fact that most of it's on the weak fingers. The melody line, which is usually at the top in Mendelssohn, not always, but mostly, is those three fingers. And then you have half the accompaniment as well, with the other half of the hand, and obviously the left hand is also, I don't like the word accompaniment, but I'm sure you know what I mean. This is where it's really at. And to be able to express that as a singer, which I think is what it's about, it sort of had unbelievable repercussions.
Tony Waters, no problem at all.
I knew that's a happen as well.
Anyway.
Are you okay? Thank you very much.
Water?
Yeah, actually, yes. I'd love some, unless you want me to stop talking. Yes. The effect that working on something like that, and also the Mozart Sonata Cycle, which I also recorded, something I always wanted to do but didn't dare until very recently. The whole nature of piano playing is different to when you're playing a piece like Rachmaninoff 3. Everything about it is a different approach. The main thing is there is no place for what I suppose, in retrospect, is the main quality of what I used to do, which was urgency. There's something about that and everything else that I played around that time that makes it sound, thank you very much, it makes the music sound urgent. And in Rachmaninoff and Prokofiev and Bartok and etc., maybe even in Liszt, Chopin, Tchaikovsky and so on, it works. That's very good. It's actually very much part of the style in most cases. Maybe less so Chopin actually, but certainly the other ones. There's no place for it in Mendelssohn, and there is certainly no place for it in Haydn and Mozart. So it's a completely different approach, and you have to be very... And I think it probably is all about this singing style. Great singers don't make it urgent. They do in certain parts of operas, obviously, but on the whole, it's about the projection of a beautiful line and breathing and giving it time and space and all the things that young pianists find hard, including me, from what I remember from a long time ago. And I think that this lockdown has been, for me, musically, a plus. For all the dreadful things that have happened around us. I actually caught it myself, by the way, in China, which was very unpleasant, but I obviously came out of it okay. And I know lots of people haven't, and it's dreadful. Just diabolical, awful thing to happen. But I have to say, I always seem to be lucky. I just came out of it all with a positive, because I was not doing all these concerts that I used to. And it really is important to stop just occasionally. And it took a virus to stop me. Yeah, just about the Chinese visit where I caught it. It was in late November 2019. And I was touring China. And it didn't include Wuhan, but it went very close to it. And I came down just before I came home, really. I came down with the most awful symptoms, plus an 8-hour flight, of course. And several concerts came and went between then and February, and it still hadn't gone. It included a chamber music tour of Siberia with that virus, which I can't describe it really. And it went very suddenly, just disappeared in March, 5 days before the first lockdown started. And I've been fine since. But what was I going to say? Yes, that's right. Yes, of course, nobody in the UK, and possibly nowhere else either, had ever really heard of this coronavirus until Christmas Eve. And that tour of China was in November. And if it wasn't coronavirus, God knows what it was. But it was something hideously awful. I couldn't get tested, of course, there were no tests. Anyway, that's in a bit of a nutshell what I'm about, I suppose. There are a few other things there, but we don't need to go into them. I think it's question time, isn't it, really? Oh, I'm sorry, Hugh. We've got another clip to play. The only reason to put this one on is that we were saying, or I was saying many hours ago, that we have very rarely come off stage, or I've very rarely come off stage and thought, yes, that's it. That's worked. I certainly didn't after that Rachmaninoff. Just occasionally it has happened that it's almost just the way I wanted it. It's never going to be absolutely, but it actually came very close when I did the Busoni concerto at the Proms in 1988, conducted by Mark Elder and the BBC Symphony Orchestra. And I just wanted to play a little bit of that for you, so that you know at least I can do it occasionally. So, thank you. This is without video, by the way. think that's a hearing aid.
Sorry?
I think it's a hearing aid that we're listening.
Yes, it is, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now the thing about that is this is the Royal Albert Hall, and it's not a particularly great recording, but it felt like such a special occasion when I did it. In fact, this gentleman was at the concert, I believe.
I wasn't there, no.
Oh, we not? Okay. You heard it?
Not very well.
Right. And actually, I've always loved the proms audience. I think most people do. That particular night they were particularly great, shall we say. We don't need to hear the final part, actually. Forget because we're getting a little bit late. But I was going to play the end of the concerto just so that you could see the way that the atmosphere was in the proms. I'd like to see it return, put it that way. That atmosphere, I mean. I don't think there's anything else to tell you about, so you tell me. What would you like to know? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, it might be getting late, but it's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have some questions from the floor, if that's all
Please.
right, Peter. Off you go, Roger.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter. Indeed, absolutely fascinating, riveting.
Thank
Let me ask a question about your role as a juror on the big international competitions. How do you prepare for that? It's a narrow question. How do you prepare, maybe mentally, physically, to go and essentially judge the great and the good?
Well, actually, yes, you're right. And one of the most important parts of it is knowing that you are in the position of possibly affecting someone's whole life. And the way we all, as jury members, prepare for it is probably extremely varied. But my way is to be fully aware of that, to make sure that I know all the pieces that they're going to play. And that includes pieces I don't play, obviously quite often. And I think I may not be in the majority, put it that way. You've got to know the music that these people are going to play, because if you don't, you are in no position to make a comment, and that's what you're there for. And I'm almost telling fellow jury members that some of them could have been better prepared. And of course, some of them are great. Some of them are wonderful. In fact, one or two of the competition juries I've been with, I've never met a more genuinely interested and committed group in some cases. I wouldn't say all cases, but actually, in all honesty, most of them. I think the competition scene when I was younger was probably more, it had more egos on the jury and more prejudice before you start to play. But having said that, I came out of it all right, so I can't really make too much of a thing of it. But I must tell you of one occasion, and obviously I can't say where it was or who it was about, but there was one occasion when a really terrific pianist was playing 2 rounds, I think, and we got another 2 to go. And a very, one of those people who thinks they know better than anyone else on the jury had the knife into this person so badly that all the rules about not talking socially about the competitors, which that is a rule that you're not supposed to do that. It's difficult not to talk about that, but you're supposed to keep quiet. No attempt whatsoever to keep quiet, and the result was that the jury was swayed. I wasn't, and in fact a couple of the others weren't, but the majority of the jury was swayed against this person by this talk that was going on, because it was so arrogant and so unbelievably kind of I know better than you do. And somehow they were, I have to say, I'm very glad I wasn't swayed, but my vote didn't count for anything, of course. That has happened. Not very often, though. It's happened more than once, but not very often. And it's very difficult to be on a jury. However much you're trying to be as fair as possible, it's a very hard job. You may well have a student in the competition, which I never have because I've never taught anyone in one-on-one at all. But it can happen. And the person who's on the jury who has a student playing there, they're required to register that so that they don't have a vote for that person. But doesn't that lead to unfairness for the other people? You know, there's all kinds of ramifications there. There are all kinds of things you've got to think about. There is always almost always a contemporary work that's been commissioned by the competition, and you have to listen to every, usually semi-finalist, playing that piece. And I can tell you, after you've heard 32 performances of the same piece of contemporary music, it's quite tricky. It's quite tricky to be objective, particularly as, of course, if you've never heard it before, the first one, you don't know a thing about it. And by the time you get to the 32nd, you know it so well that you don't ever want to see it again. And, you know, and all the things that implies. And you've got to guard against it. I suppose that's what it amounts to. You must be on your guard against your own tendencies. Racial prejudice is something that used to happen, which fortunately doesn't anymore. Gender prejudice, you name it. You name any prejudice you want. It's bound to be a possibility, you know. And you've got to make sure you don't suffer from it. I have a memory of, again, I can't be specific, but of the first pianist of, I think, 32. It was 32. The very first one who drew the lottery, you know, at the beginning when you choose the order. She chose to play first. I mean, the lottery that was the result of it. And during that performance, this was the first day of probably 5 days, if I'm not mistaken, of first round. So we're talking about a big competition. During that performance, the jury was still opening their briefcases, trying to work out which pieces he was playing. All sorts of things were going on the whole way through this performance of the first entrant. It was very good playing. And when it came to the vote, it was as if they hadn't heard it. Well, it was, I think, probably that they hadn't heard it. I was again in the minority. I thought it was really terrific, but he didn't go through to the second round. And I have to tell you, he's been extraordinarily successful now with other competitions. And I think it's partly because he played first. Well, mainly because of that. Just not in gear. So you have to be in gear before you start the first round. It's as simple as that. When I was in the Moscow competition myself, there was an American girl who was a good pianist from New York, and she'd been in it the previous time as well, and she'd drawn number 1, and she drew it again. Now, what the odds of that? I can't. There were 104 competitors in 1982, and she got the first again, and she had to go on, and of course, just got eliminated. And she was good as well. It's hard to do, but you've got to try at least, you know. I don't know how else to answer it really, because we're all different. I mean, you know, I think I'm sorry, just going on from that. Moscow is different because the whole country, certainly in the Soviet time, was interested in the whole competition, and it was on live on Soviet TV, every note of that competition. And that's 110 million people. It seems to me, I think it's 110. It seems to me quite likely that most of them watched it because there wasn't much else to do. As you said before, it's like match of the day, you know. It's just an incredibly important event in the life of that country, or it was. So it is different. But most competitions, first of all, the media don't broadcast anything until the final, in the majority of cases. That's if you're lucky that they do the final. The final is usually with an orchestra. So what you hear, what the public hear on the telly, is the performance that they give with an orchestra. Not any sense of what they're like on their own. And I can assure you that it's very different for the pianist or the soloist of any instrument to be playing with other people, to be able to organise a rehearsal properly with a conductor. You are reliant upon the conductor being good, which again is not 100% guaranteed. Sometimes it's very good, but other times it's not. what the general public then hear is just an extremely monochrome sort of a flashpoint. Is that the right word? Just a sort of a single insight into what they can do. And sometimes it isn't very good because I've never played with an orchestra before, having played wonderful first, second, third rounds. And you can end up with a situation where the next round is so different to the one before that the jury looks like a bunch of idiots. They just think, well, why did they put that one through? Or vice versa. You know, sometimes they exceed expectations beyond all belief in the next round. But that, of course, is less likely because of the elimination. And I think it's a very important thing for the public and possibly the media and the critics and everyone who's involved to actually remember that playing a concerto final is another world to play anything else, really. I think I mentioned before. Oh, no, I didn't mention it in here before. No, we were talking before about the difficulty of choosing which is the better one of two artists. There are two difficulties there. One of them might be 16 and the other one nearly 30. So how do you choose between the two of them? Not on the basis of how they play at the time, but on the basis of what the prize will do to them. Because if it's a major competition and they're 16, it could very easily spoil them for life. So that's difficult. And then there's the other one, which is when you have someone who's consistently brilliant, really excellent at everything, every different style that they play, and there's another one who is hopeless in some things but absolutely genius in something else, which of those ought to go through? And I don't know what the answer is. I do know that on one of maybe the most major one I've been on as a jury member, in the end, the one who was consistently great in all the pieces was the one who won. And the one who was brilliant at one piece, but not so great at some of the others, was eliminated, actually. And such is the... Oh, no, I better not go into that because it reveals where it was. But yes, I mean, that can happen, and it's a difficult choice, it has to be said. And what do you do when... let's talk about Moscow for a moment. What do you do when there are two concertos, and one of them's by Mozart, and the other is inevitably going to be Russian? Rachmaninoff, Tchaikovsky, Prokofiev, whatever it may be. But then there's the Mozart. And you're supposed to balance these two. Well, of course, one of them is going to be better than the other. And usually it will be that the Russian repertoire will be better than the Mozart, because the sort of people who enter that competition are not the sort of people who want a career playing Viennese classical music at that stage of their life. So how do you compare those? What do you say when somebody plays a great Mozart? You think, oh, my word, this is better than any of the other Mozarts. And then the Rachmaninoff doesn't go so well. What are you going to write down? You know, there are all these things that you really need to think about beforehand and be very aware of other jury members' tendencies as well. It's quite a tricky one.
Don't you think you can learn more about a pianist doing a NAS semi-final recital on varied repertoire than you do on a single performance of a concerto in the final?
Oh, you certainly do, yeah. Yeah.
Because, I mean, most pianists are going to spend their time giving recitals rather than doing piano concertos.
Particularly these days, yes, that's true. Yes. Yes, and actually the practical side of their future is one of the things you've got to be aware of. What I meant by the 16-year-old winning a major competition, for example. I mean, you remember being 16? I don't, really. The idea of what happened to me the next day after that Rachmaninoff final happening to me at 16 is just, I just can't imagine being able to deal with it at all. And there are all kinds of personal reasons why that's a problem. You might have a son or a daughter, or you might have a wife, you might not, you might be single. You might not know very much repertoire. At 16, you're not likely to have a wife, are you? Unless you, well, no. But, I mean, it's extremely doubtful that you know, anyone's got any kind of predictable pattern. I would say I didn't. After that competition final, I was invited, sometimes only once, to various places. and sometimes ignored totally. It was like the competition hadn't happened in certain parts of the world. And it turned out, with the very people who hadn't done anything about it, when I met them later, that the reason was that the agencies had not sent them anything. They just hadn't received it. So they're thinking, well, that's terrific for a young artist.
Questions at all? Please.
This is a very mundane question. You must be so
I like those.
dependent on the keyboard, the piano itself. Have you ever had any keyboard disasters because of the piano?
Oh, of course, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Less so recently, but in my early days, many times, yes.
And
Yeah.
what do you do then?
Well, it depends on how near the beginning of the piece it was, or what actually happens to the key. You mean the piano rather
Yes,
than just the
exactly,
keyboard?
yes.
Yeah, I mean, if a string breaks as soon as you start, then it spoiled the performance for everybody if you carry on, because every time you hit that, hit is not a very good word, but you know what I mean, every time you play that note, it will twang. So you can't really, if it's near the beginning, you must stop. If it's later on, you must make the choice. It's very hard to know, to be honest, what to do. But some of my favourite ones, they're usually in countries where they don't really have a great history of maintenance. Well, you know, and actually Leningrad, as it used to be called, remember those days? Now St. Petersburg. I was there once playing the Rachmaninoff second. And if you know the piece intimately, you'll remember that there's a very big tune near the end, with the orchestra playing the tune, the piano accompanying it. Big climax of the whole piece. And just before it, there's a cadenza, which has quite a difficult little leap in it. And it's a very prominent G natural that you know you couldn't possibly play wrongly without people knowing. So we're all a little bit nervous of that. This is in the performance, and I played the G natural, and I'd obviously put so much effort into it that it broke the piano stool. It was right. The G was right, I have to say. But the piano stool went like that, very suddenly. I don't know whether a screw came out or something, but maybe the sort of the big screw mechanism was broken or something. But it was at 45 degrees all of a sudden. And I was in danger of falling into the front row of the audience. And we had another 2 pages to go. You just have to do it, don't you? If it's the first line of the concerto, then it's time to sort the piano out, the piano stool out, rather. But that was one of my favourite moments. I actually, eventually, because there was a little ridge at the end of the stage, this is the Philharmonia Hall in St. Petersburg, and I put my foot on it like that, so that I didn't fall into the audience, and played the rest of it like a sort of, at an angle, with no pedal. They didn't seem to notice. That was the rather... That was really strange. Can I tell another little story about events on stage? In the city of Wuhan, which is quite famous now, I believe, I played there in 2017, I think. And I was playing the encore. It was a recital in the University Concert Hall. Playing the encore, and which was Ravel, I think. And a door onto the stage opened, and a guy came in with 3 women and mop and buckets and started and he got on his mobile phone and had a perfectly normal audible conversation, obviously in Mandarin, to someone else, and there was absolutely no attempt whatsoever to keep it down. And they were obviously aware that I was playing the piano, and there was a public out there, and I'm thinking surely the public's going to object to this. It was like nothing was happening. So I just carried on, got to the end, they applauded. And then loads of people came backstage, and they were really nice about the concert. So, it wasn't like they weren't involved. It's just that the situation is so different that it's okay to go and mop the stage whilst somebody's doing a concert. And I thought that was really quite sweet.
Questions?
Please.
Hi. So I couldn't resist just one. In your formative years as a young chap,
I'm just coming out of them now.
was there any particular pianist at your time that sort of influenced your future playing?
Yeah, it was Richter. maybe not only Richter, but very definitely the main one, I would say. And that was partly because I did a performance with my father involved in the Masonic temple in central Manchester when I was 14 or something, which is normally not allowed by the Masons, of course. But they, for some reason, I think it was, thank you very much, for some reason, I think it was to do with the school headmaster or other parents or something, there was this invitation for me to go and play for the Masons. And, and they gave me an LP of Richter playing Tchaikovsky's First Concerto with Carry-On, and the book token. In fact, 2 book tokens, to reward me for this performance. And we got the record onto the turntable at home, and I was absolutely bowled over by it. And if you listen to it now, Carry-On wasn't following him at all well. It's all over the place. Carry-On was at his greatest in opera and symphonies, I think. In concertos, he liked to be in control of that as well, and of course Richter wasn't controllable, so they just came. But at the age of 14, it sounded absolutely fantastic because it was the degree to which it sounded like he meant it, that it was such a commitment from him, and there was no attempt to be about Richter. It was about Tchaikovsky, you know, and that's so important, of course. So yes, I mean, he then became my hero, and there were others as well. Rubinstein was one of them. Clifford Curzon was another. At that time. Later on, I started to admire the younger generation more. Hero now is Lang Lang, I suppose. And he's about a third of my age. Actually, half. Let's keep it realistic.
Well, I think we should wind up this fabulous afternoon. I think it's been a real experience to have someone like Peter, who's been everywhere, played everywhere, done everything, to talk to us. We have so many pianists come and play here. They're usually about 22 and a half. And they dream of a single date of one of these prestigious venues. And this is what they're aiming for. I'm surprised more of them aren't here to hear your thoughts about it all, but they can watch on the internet. And it's been a real privilege, Peter.
Oh, well, thank you.
Next
thank you
time we'll get you to play on that thing as well. But
yeah, I'll do that.
It's been really terrific.
Thank you very
I've
much.
admired you from afar for 40 years, not 60 years. But it's been a fantastic afternoon. Thank you very much. A lot to think about. I'd also like to thank our technicians who've made it all possible, because it's quite complicated having a talk with video clips that you can not only show to the audience here, but put on the internet. All sorts of problems arise, and I'm extremely indebted to Simon Shute, George Auckland, Rob Jenkins for making it all possible. And if you've enjoyed it from afar, you might like to donate via our website. Please do so. It'd be very much appreciated. And we carry on as per usual with one of these pianists in 2 days' time. Joanna Kaparek is a wonderful Polish pianist, and so it goes on. Thank you very much for being with us, and a very good afternoon. And a big round of applause for Peter. Thank you.